Okay, the final stretch of chapter 29. It's only like 5 pages, but there's so many words, and I don't like that. Oh well. I almost bit my freaking owl. Okay. I gotta get this done super fast. Okay, I'm on page 685, and I'm just reading to the end. Wilson steps down from Olympus. Woodrow Wilson had helped to win the war. What part would he now play in shaping the peace? Expectations ran extravagantly high. As the fighting in Europe crashed to a close, the American president towered at the summit of his popularity and power. In lonely huts in the mountains of Italy, candles burned before poster portraits of revered American prophet. In Poland, starry-eyed university students would meet in the streets, clasp hands, and utter only one word: Wilson. No other man had ever occupied so dizzy a pinnacle as moral leader of the world, but at this fateful moment, his sureness of touch deserted him, and he began to make a series of tragic fumbles. Hoping to strengthen his hand at the Paris peace table, Wilson personally appealed for the Democratic victory in the congressional elections of November 1918, but the maneuver backfired when voters instead returned a narrow Republican majority to Congress. Having staked his reputation on the outcome, Wilson went to Paris as a diminished leader. Unlike all the parliamentary statesmen at the table, he did not command a legislative majority at home. Wilson's decision to go in person to Paris helped make the peace infuriate the Republicans. At the time, no president had traveled to Europe, and Wilson's journey looked to his critics like a flamboyant grandstanding. He further ruffled Republican feathers when he snubbed the Senate in assembling his peace delegation and neglected to include a single Republican senator in his official party. The logical choice was the new chairman of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, aristocratically bewhiskered Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. But Wilson loathed him, and the feeling was hotly reciprocated. An accomplished author with a Harvard Ph.D., Lodge had been known as a scholar in politics until Wilson came on the scene. The two men were at daggers drawn, personally and politically. An idealist amid the imperialists. Idealist Woodrow Wilson received tumultuous welcomes from the masses of France, England, and Italy, even as their wary statesmen tried to keep the new Messiah at arm's length from worshipful crowds. When it came to negotiating the shape of the post-war world, the Paris Conference of Great and Small Nations began on January 18, 1919. The Allies formed an inner clique known as the Big Four, with Wilson representing the richest and freshest great power, more or less in charge. He was joined by General Premier Vittorio Orlando of Italy and brilliant Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain. Perhaps the most realistic of the quartet was cynical, hard-bitten Premier Georges Clemenceau of France, known as the Tiger. Wilson first bent his energies to preventing any eventual parcelling out of the former colonies and protectorates of the vanquished powers. He was less attentive to the fate of colonies beginning to the victorious French and English. Wilson tried to force through a compromise between naked imperialism and idealism. The victors would not make possession of the conquered territory outright, but would receive it as his trustees of the League of Nations. Strategic Syria, for example, was awarded to France, and oil-rich Iraq went to Britain. In practice, this half-loaf solution was a little more than the old pre-war colonial... old pre-war colonialism, thinly disguised, although in the decades to come, anti-colonial independence movements would wield the Wilsonian ideal of self-determination against their imperial occupiers. Meanwhile, Wilson had been serving as a midwife for a world parliament known as the League of Nations, which he envisioned as containing an assembly with the seats for all nations and a council to be controlled by the great powers. To his great satisfaction, in February 1919, his fellow treaty makers agreed to make the League Covenant, Wilson's brainchild, an integral part of the final peace treaty. But tough bargains and grinding compromises loomed ahead in Paris. The hard-headed Clemenceau pressed French demands for the German-inhabited Rhineland and the Saar Valley, a rich coal area, faced with fierce Wilsonian opposition to the violation of self-determination. France settled for a compromise whereby the Saar Basin would remain under the League of Nations for 15 years, and then a popular vote would determine its fate. Wilson's next battle was with Italy over Fiume, a valuable seaport inhabited by both Italians and Yugoslavs. When Italy demanded Fiume, Wilson insisted that the seaport go to Yugoslavia and appealed over the heads of Italy's leaders to the country's masses. The maneuver fell flat. The Italian delegates went home in a huff, while Italian masses turned savagely against Wilson. Another crucial struggle was with Japan over China's Shandong Peninsula and the German diamonds in the Pacific. Hold on one sec. Okay. In the Pacific, which the Japanese had seized during the war, Japan received the strategic Pacific Islands under a League of Nations mandate, but Wilson staunchly opposed Japanese control of Shandong as a violation of self-determination for its 30 million Chinese residents. When the Japanese threatened to walk out, however, Wilson reluctantly accepted a compromise whereby Japan kept Germany's economic holdings on China's Shandong Peninsula and pledged to return the peninsula to China at a later date. The Chinese were outraged by this imperialistic solution, while Clemenceau jeered that Wilson talked like Jesus Christ and acted like Lord George. A completed Treaty of Versailles, after more weeks of wrangling, was handed to the Germans in June 1919, almost literally on the point of a bayonet. Excluded from the settlement negotiations at Paris, Germany had capitulated in the hope that it would be granted a peace based on the 14 points. A careful analysis of the treaty shows that only about 4 of the 23 original Wilsonian points had subsequent principles that were fully honored. Vengeance, not reconciliation, was the treaty's dominant tone. Loud and bitter cries of betrayal burst from German throats, charges that Adolf Hitler would soon reiterate during his meteoric rise to power. Wilson was guilty of no conscious betrayal, but the Allied powers were torn by conflicting aims, many of them sanctioned by secret treaties. There had to be a compromise at Paris, or there would be no agreement. Faced with hard realities, Wilson was forced to abandon some of his less cherished 14 points in order to salvage the more precious League of Nations. At the same time, the loudly condemned treaty actually held much to commend it. Not least among its merits was the liberation of millions of minority peoples, such as the Poles, from the yoke of imperial dynasties. Wilson's battle for ratification. Returning to America, Wilson sailed straight into a political typhoon. Isolationists raised a whirlwind of protests against the treaty, especially against Wilson's commitment to ushering the United States into his newfangled League of Nations, which they regarded either as a useless sewing circle or an overpotent superstate. The opposition's hardcore was composed of a dozen or so militants led by Senator William Borah of Idaho and Hiram Johnson of California, known as irreconcilables. Invoking the revered advice of Washington and Jefferson, they wanted no part of any entangling alliance. Nor was the isolationist Wilson's only problem. Critics showered the Treaty of Versailles with abuse from all sides. Rabid Hun haters regarded the pact as not harsh enough. Principled liberals thought it too punitive. German Americans, Italian Americans, and others whom Wilson had termed hyphenated Americans were aroused because the peace settlement was not sufficiently favorable to their native lands. Irish Americans in particular feared that the League would empower Britain in the face of any movement for Irish independence. Despite mounting discontent, a strong majority of the people still seemed favorable to the treaty, with the Wilson League firmly riveted in it as Part 1 at this time. Early July 1919, Senator Lodge had no real hope of defeating the Treaty of Versailles. His strategy was merely to amend it in such a way as to Americanize, republicanize, or senatorialize it. Lodge effectively used delay to muddle and divide public opinion. He read the entire 264-page treaty aloud in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and held protracted hearings in which people of various nationalities aired their grievances. Wilson fretted increasingly as the hot summer of 1919 wore on. The bulky pact was bogged down in the Senate while the nation was drifting into confusion and apathy. He therefore decided to take his case to the country in a spectacular speech-making tour. Wilson undertook a strenuous barnstorming campaign despite protests from physicians and friends. The president had never been robust. He had entered the White House nearly 7 years before with a stomach pump and with headache pills for his neuritis. His frail body had begun to sag under the strain of his first wife's death in 1914, partisan strife, a global war, and a stressful peace conference. But he declared that he was willing to die, like the soldiers he had sent into battle, for the sake of the New World Order. The presidential tour, begun in September 1919, started off shakily in the isolationist strongholds of the Midwest, but the reception improved in the Rocky Mountain region and on the Pacific coast. The high point and the breaking point of the return trip came in Pueblo, Colorado, September 25, 1919. With tears coursing down his cheeks, Wilson pleaded for the League of Nations as the only real hope of preventing future wars. That night he collapsed from physical and nervous exhaustion. A funeral train whisked him back to Washington, where several days later a stroke paralyzed one side of his body. During the next few weeks, he lay in a darkened room in the White House. For more than 7 months, he did not meet with his cabinet. Senator Lodge was now at the helm. After failing to amend the treaty outright, he finally came up with 14 formal reservations to it, a sardonic slap at Wilson's 14 points. These safeguards reserved the rights of the United States under the Monroe Doctrine and the Constitution and otherwise sought to protect American sovereignty. Wilson, hating Lodge, saw red at the mere suggestion of the Lodge reservations. Too feeble to lead, Wilson remained strong enough to obstruct. When the day finally came for the Senate vote, he sent word to all true Democrats to vote against the treaty with the odious Lodge reservations attached. Wilson hoped that when these were cleared away, the path would be open for ratification without reservations or with only some mild Democratic ones. On November 19, 1919, loyal Democrats in the Senate did Wilson's bidding, helping to reject the treaty. All told, about 4/5 of senators professed to favor the treaty, with or without reservations, yet a simple majority could not agree on a single proposition. It went down 55 to 39. So strong was public indignation at the vote that the Senate was forced to act a second time. In March 1920, the treaty was brought up again with the Lodge reservations tacked on. There was only one possible path to success, passing the act with the reservations included, but the sickly Wilson, still sheltered behind drawn curtains, again sent word to all loyal Democrats to vote down the treaty with the obnoxious reservations. He thus signed the death warrant of the treaty as far as America was concerned. On March 19, 1920, the treaty netted a simple majority but failed to get the necessary two-thirds majority by a count of 49 yeas to 35 nays. Who defeated the treaty? The Lodge-Wilson personal feud, traditionalism, isolationism, disillusionment, and partisanship all contributed to the confused picture, but Wilson himself must bear a substantial share of the responsibility. He asked for all or nothing. and got nothing. All right. The Solemn Referendum of 1920. Wilson proposed to settle the treaty issue in the forthcoming presidential campaign of 1920 by appealing to the people for a solemn referendum. This was sheer folly, for a true mandate on the League in the noisy arena of politics was clearly impossible. Jubilant Republicans gathered in Chicago in June 1920 with wayward bull moosers back in the corral after Theodore Roosevelt's death in 1990, and the senatorial old guard back in the saddle. A group of Senate bosses, meeting in the historic smoke-filled room 404 of the Hotel Blackstone, informally decided on the affable and valuable Senator Warren G. Harding of Ohio as the party's presidential nominee, to run with the folksy backstabbing former newspaper editor. The party nominated for Vice President frugal, grim-faced Governor Calvin, Silent Cal, Coolidge of Massachusetts. Meeting in San Francisco, Democrats nominated earnest Governor James M. Cox of Ohio, who strongly supported the League. His running mate was Assistant Navy Secretary Franklin D. Roosevelt, a young, handsome, vibrant New Yorker. Democratic attempts to make the campaign a referendum on the League were thwarted by Senator Harding, who offered muddled and contradictory statements on the issue from his front porch. With newly enfranchised women swelling the vote totals, Harding was swept into power with a prodigious plurality of over 7 million votes, 16 million to 9 million for Cox, the largest victory margin to that date in a presidential election. The electoral count was 404 to 127. Eugene V. Debs, federal prisoner number 9,653 at the Atlanta Penitentiary, rolled up the largest vote ever for the left-wing Socialist Party, 919,000. Oh, my daughter scratched at the door. Public desire for a change found vent in resounding repudiation of high and mighty Wilsonism. Tired of star-reaching idealism and soothed by Harding's promise of a return to normalcy, voters were willing to accept a second-rate president, and they got a third-rate one. Republican isolationists successfully turned Harding's victory into a death sentence for the League. Politicians increasingly shunned the League as they would a leaper? I don't know. When the legendary Wilson died in 1924, admirers knelt in the snow outside Washington home. His great vision of a League for peace had perished long before. Okay, last heading. Yes, the last heading. Okay, the betrayal of great expectations. America's spurning of the League was tragically short-sighted. The Republic had helped to win a costly war, but it foolishly kicked the fruits of victory under the table. Whether a strong international organization would have averted World War II in 1939 will always be a matter of dispute, but there can be no doubt that the orphaned League of Nations was undercut at the start by the refusal of the mightiest power on the globe to join it. The ultimate collapse of the Treaty of Versailles must be laid, at least in some degree, to America's doorstep. This complicated pact, tied in with the 4 other peace treaties through the League Covenant, was a top-heavy structure designed to rest on a 4-legged table. When the 4th leg, the United States, was never put into place, the rickety contraption teetered for over a decade and then crashed in ruins, a debacle that played into the hands of the German demagogue Adolf Hitler. The Senate's rejection of a security treaty with France pledging American support in the event of another German invasion likewise proved disastrous. That spurning compelled France to begin rearming aggressively, which drove the Germans, illegally, to do the same. The United States heard its own cause when it buried its head in the sand. Granted, the conduct of its allies had been disillusioning. Carrying it through the Wilsonian program would have served its own interests. Had it forthrightly assumed its war-bound responsibilities and resolutely embraced the role of global leader, the United States could have used its enormous strength to shape the world's future. Instead, it permitted the warring nations of World War I blithely to drift towards the abyss of a second and even more bloody international disaster. Finished! Okay. What a long chapter. Whew.